What's up, folks? So there's a pattern that I've seen happening more and more often ever since the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2, and it's the amount of people that seemingly have either regretted their purchase, or they feel like they probably jumped in way too soon and should have waited until 2026 at least. And I think there are a number of reasons as to why that could have been, many of which have already been discussed on this channel pretty in depth. But personally, I didn't really want to speak too much about it because I was kind of waiting for this moment. The post-Nintendo Direct moment, because for a lot of people, since the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2, well, actually, since April 2nd when the first Direct happened, a lot of people jumped into Nintendo's new console very blindly with the expectation that Nintendo was going to be delivering more throughout the end of the year. And it was absolutely a very popular talking point online. And while this past Direct kind of proved that there wasn't anything major expected through the end of the year, pretty much what we're getting is what we learned fairly early on, there have been a lot of steps along the way that have, at minimum, raised people's eyebrows and had them question their spending habits, to the point where I actually think this Direct was not the first sign of trouble, it was actually the final nail in the coffin for a lot of these people, where they are very likely officially convinced that the Nintendo Switch 2 is not worth it for them. And over the course of this short video, I'd like to go over some of the major talking points that happened early on, and how as time has gone on, this has just made hype and sales just slip away from the Nintendo Switch 2. And let me preface this by saying that I don't expect many people that are very passionate about the Switch 2 to understand anything that I'm about to say. And I would also say to an extent Nintendo is not completely at fault for some of this, not explicitly anyway, but they are part of the major problem. And it's primarily because they do not communicate with the fan base, they're not very clear about what's coming, and through all of the great ways they've found to manipulate the algorithm and manipulate their audiences and their fandom, they're at the point now where they just let the crazies do the talking for them. So, for example, we've recently come to a point where the Nintendo Switch 2, depending on how much effort a developer wants to put into it, at best might have some tiny moments and glimmers of hope where it could somewhat outperform the Xbox Series S. And at worst, it's just a little bit better than the base model PS4. Usually landing somewhere around the PS4 Pro, maybe even slightly weaker than that on average. Now, this is important because one of the earliest talking points in the Nintendo Switch 2's life was how powerful this thing was actually going to be compared to other consoles. We sit here today in September and we're like, yeah, it can almost trade blows with the Series S, what did you expect from a handheld? But that wasn't the discourse online a few months ago. Actually, we're close to like 5 months ago now. The idea for many people was that this thing would at minimum be a Series S, maybe not quite at the levels of the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, but it would be at least comparable. And this obviously has a lot to do with the initial Direct that we saw from Nintendo. They were very clear about focusing on 120 frames per second. They were adamant that people understood that this was a device that would go up to 4K and it was way stronger than the original Nintendo Switch. Now, technically, Nintendo didn't lie. This device does support 120 frames per second. Games like Hollow Knight have shown that. And many games do go up to 4K, but the average buyer, the person that's not really involved in a lot of the discourse online, maybe they search a few things and read what's said in a few forums, maybe they just watch the initial Direct or some trailers. As far as they were concerned, this is going to be a handheld device that's going to support 4K 60 frames per second. And without a thought, with the console being available, naturally, they went and bought it fairly early on in its life. Even if there wasn't a game they were interested in just yet, they probably figured, who knows how long this thing's gonna be in stock, and who knows what's gonna happen with tariffs, who knows if they're gonna increase the price in future years, I might as well just grab it and then I can always just play the games that I enjoy on this Switch 2 later on when they come out. I don't think the launch lineup bothered too many people because they were just occupied by Mario Kart. That was enough to keep them busy for a bit, and then if they wanted to indulge and enjoy something first party, Donkey Kong Bonanza was right around the corner. The issue, however, is that Mario Kart is not a game that'll keep you busy for a very long time. And I still stand by the belief that you don't buy a console for Mario Kart, you buy Mario Kart because you got the Nintendo console. If you recall, a lot of people very early on in the Switch 2's life, with all the sales numbers that Mario Kart was pulling because it was bundled in with 90% of the consoles, or maybe it was closer to like 80%, but there was just so much discussion about how this is automatically, without a shadow of a doubt, the best Mario Kart game ever, and the most optimistic of Nintendo fans would be in the discussion of Game of the Year, and all of these Mario Kart flags that were just being waved all around the world about how this game is gonna change the world. It's Mario Kart. It's not gonna change the world. And now it's at the point where basically the only reason this game is selling as well as it is because there are still bundles of it available. It's not that it's a bad game, but I mean, it's Mario Kart. And obviously Nintendo doesn't help the case with the image of this game because they updated it, making it objectively worse, and then they updated it again to fix it, and somehow that didn't help at all. And then everybody still loves Mario Kart 8 Deluxe too, and that works on the Switch too. So then you have the first primary flagship title, the one that was bundled in with the console. Already people are very sick of it. Many people have completely lost interest, and it's an online multiplayer game that's supposed to keep you busy for a very long time. People have gotten so bored of this game that a Sonic racing game is getting praised for the first time in over a decade. And it's not even out yet. I am so excited for the demo that's coming out tomorrow. But the point is that you'll see this sentiment quite a bit online. Somebody will say, yeah, I bought the Switch 2 and then it came with Mario Kart, and then I haven't touched it in 2 months because after 2 weeks I was done with Mario Kart. I didn't really want to play it anymore. Now, I mentioned that Bananza was going to be released as well, and that game was a good release, and I would argue should have been the flagship title that was bundled with the console. But for a lot of people, and I am not one of them, despite not having played Bananza yet, that is like the one game where I was like, if something makes me fold and buy a Switch 2, it's going to be that game, because I can tell it's going to be fun. Odyssey is one of my favorite games of all time. This is made by the same people. I love Donkey Kong. It all works out. But the fact of the matter is, the clear reality based off of sales of these franchises over time is that Donkey Kong is absolutely not Mario, and it's not Zelda. And the initial sales completely reflect that. So no matter how good of a game Donkey Kong Bonanza is, it's not going to get that same level of hype, that same level of energy that Breath of the Wild did and that Mario Odyssey did. And again, now people are like, well, of course not. It's not Mario, it's not Zelda. But prior to the launch of this game, that was very much where the talk was. So let's assume that, I don't know, half, let's say 33% of the people that bought a Switch 2 on a whim bought it because they're not really that big of Nintendo fans. Maybe they have another console or a PC and then the Nintendo Switch was going to be their handheld. They had the Switch 1, they bought all of the main big hitters, the best sellers from the Switch 1, and they just wanted to continue on with those same franchises for the Switch 2. Well, over the course of the first 2 months, they got a Mario Kart game. Okay, they played it for 2 weeks and got bored. And then Donkey Kong, they didn't really have interest in it. They wanted Mario, despite the fact that everybody was shoving Donkey Kong down their throat. So obviously at that point, now you got nothing else to buy. You start looking towards the third-party titles. First and foremost, the biggest issue with the third-party titles that people are facing with the Nintendo Switch 2 is that most of the games up till this point in time have been ports of old games. So with all of the praise something like Cyberpunk gets, that was like a, 4 or 5 year old game by the time it hit the Switch 2 at launch. But even if you wanted to use Cyberpunk as a test, as something that would get people to buy into the Nintendo Switch 2, when you do a lot of those benchmark tests, and I know Digital Foundry did a few of those tests on it, they concluded that Cyberpunk was sitting somewhere in between the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro. Now, again, Nintendo didn't promise that this thing would be as strong as a PS5, but a lot of people bought into this device expecting stronger than PS4. Close to Series S. Whether you'd like to blame the buyer or not, that's debatable, but that's not going to change the fact that they're disappointed with their purchase because it's not as strong as they expected. So they might be like, why would I spend my money, why would I waste my money on Cyberpunk for the Switch 2? I'm probably going to end up playing it not handheld anyway because it's such a beefy game and it'll drain my battery. And it's available for cheaper on the PC and on my Xbox. And that same discussion can be had for games like Yakuza, for Street Fighter. Even if they run well, it doesn't mean that they're now the optimal way to play the game for a lot of these folks. So over the course of that first 1 or 2 months, the console just gets ignored. And mind you, at this point in time, I'm not even discussing like the amount of storage that's available in the console, which is not nearly enough, how expensive the SD cards for the console are, the whole game keycard situation. I'm not discussing the bans and the piracy. I'm discussing it from the perspective of somebody that bought a Switch 2 and doesn't really care that much about all of this discussion, is just trying to play games. So then after July, you go through all of August, and the only thing that Nintendo is really pushing out to the masses is Drag and Drive. You get some upgrade packs in there too, don't get me wrong. Mario Party is a huge name. A lot of people buy Mario Party. They're like, I got a Nintendo console, let me get Mario Party. They go and buy the upgrade pack for that, and it finds out that it's not really worth it because it's just a sham. Kirby and the Forgotten Land is also another one that pops up eventually, and that looks good. And for a lot of people, it might be worth it. For others, they might be like, I don't really care about Kirby as much. And then along the way, you get some bright spots that are talked about online, but they're just not appealing to you. WWE 2K25, this game runs great on the Switch too. That's awesome, right? Except, how many people actually want to play a wrestling game? Like, I'm not saying that to belittle WWE games. I realize there is a huge fandom of WWE fans, but you can't guarantee that it's like, oh, this one third-party title that runs the best, everybody's got to buy it now because it runs well. No, the reality is a lot of people will be like, cool, I'm glad it runs well. Where are the sports games? And before I get to the sports games, it's the same idea with Star Wars Outlaws. Star Wars Outlaws is the game that was the most effort was put into it over any other game on the Nintendo Switch 2 as far as ports go, in my opinion. And Ubisoft did a very good job making sure this game runs as well as it does on the Nintendo Switch 2. But again, you still fall back to that same issue. A lot of people that initially bought into the Nintendo Switch 2 already have either a PS5 or an Xbox or a PC, something that could run this game better. And they either bought this game already or they were not interested in this game because it was a flop. So no matter how well Star Wars Outlaws does, at the end of the day, this game has been crapped on. It's been dragged through the mud over the course of the past year. And now all of a sudden you're supposed to be like, yeah, this game runs great on the Switch 2. Everybody's got to go and buy it. And once again, that's not exactly how this works. And you know, it doesn't help that a lot of the third-party titles that are coming out now have issues all across the board. Daemon X Machina, Chronos, they all still run worse on the Switch 2, but they're having problems elsewhere as well. Borderlands 4 is not even out yet, it's going to be coming out later. And likewise with Sonic Racing Crossworld, a game that a lot of people are very hyped for, and it had more than 1 million people download the open beta recently, with over 10 million races happening over the course of Labor Day weekend. And guess what? You can't buy it on the Nintendo Switch 2 when it comes out later this month, because it's not going to be available until down the line. So there's a feeling for a lot of these people, at least early on, that they bought into a console that's either not getting the games early enough, or they're getting older games, and in most cases these games are not running as well as they should. Fortnite on the Switch 2 is worse than playing it on the Series S. It's got 60 FPS, it can do the job, but if you have something else to play it on, you're not going to play it on the Switch 2. Or, sorry, rather, you don't need to play it on the Switch 2. And I use Fortnite as an example because that's a very huge game, right? That's a very important game for a lot of people. It's one of the most active games currently. And then if you think about it strictly from the Western market here in the United States, NBA 2K26 comes out, Madden NFL come out, and while obviously there are a lot of people that will buy these games and they'll be completely okay with the downgrade in the frames per second, the average buyer of these titles is not looking for the okay Nintendo experience of a sports title. There are a lot of buyers of Madden, a lot of buyers of NBA 2K, and even upcoming EAFC, which is set to be at 30 frames per second, which bought into this console early on because they were like, worst case scenario, I'll just buy my new Madden on there and that'll keep me busy. I'll buy NBA, I'll buy EAFC on there, and everything will be fine and dandy. And these games were being advertised as having parity with the other major console releases. It was like this dream idea that the Nintendo Switch 2 now was like competing with the big boys. You can buy your sports title on this thing, it'll be the exact same experience. And that goes the same with something like Call of Duty, where everybody was like, oh, Microsoft is going to be releasing it everywhere. They promised, they signed a paper, and it's still not on the console. So there are these major titles that people were expecting to play when they got the Nintendo Switch 2. Now in the case of Call of Duty, obviously it didn't make it to the Switch 2, but these sports titles made it to the Switch 2, but they don't have cross-platform, they run at half the frames per second. And look, the frames per second discussion is important because for a lot of people, they consider 30 frames per second unacceptable. And that goes double for a sports title. And again, to reiterate, this is not to say that people should expect the Switch 2 to be able to do these things better. There are technological limitations, something that I don't understand because I'm not a game developer. But what I do know is that specifically, people were like, this is a tablet that runs 4K 60 frames per second, and they expected to buy games that would run at 4K 60 frames per second. That's just what they believed. Or, you know, maybe there was like some kind of performance mode that balances things out. All of these things, one after the other, just pile on for the first 3 months of the Switch 2's life. But there's always a silver lining, right? There's an announcement for a Splatoon game, but it's an expansion. It's not like that multiplayer experience that you would expect from Splatoon. Hyrule Warriors, if that's your thing, then you could be excited about that. Kirby Air Riders, I mean, it's very niche. And for a lot of people, it's just another kart racer. Not for me, mind you. I think Kirby Air Riders is easily going to be a phenomenal title, but that average person is not going to look at it the same way they would look at something massive, something that would excite them for this console, something that they have to go out and buy. But all of these titles that are announced through the end of the year, they all have like some kind of an asterisk. It's like, okay, it's big, but is it like that thing, that excitement that I'm looking for? Again, that Mario Odyssey sequel, that Breath of the Wild sequel, Smash Bros, even arguably a new Mario Party. Mario Party sells very well, and that's the reason why the Switch 2 edition is doing as well as it does, despite being the worst of the Switch 2 editions. But the problem is, through all of this discussion and all of this time people are waiting for the next big announcement, they're just frequently told that there's this upcoming Nintendo Direct that's going to be dangled in front of your face. And that's what Nintendo is going to just pull out all of the stops, and they're going to surprise everybody, and you're going to understand why you bought this thing. It's going to have all of the exciting games announced upcoming, and your hype will never be higher. And I think it's very telling that the most exciting thing to come out from that Direct is Super Mario Galaxy 2. Now look, I love Super Mario Galaxy 2, but as it stands, it seems like the top Switch 2 exclusives for the first year of the Nintendo Switch 2's life are another Mario Kart that's kind of underwhelming, a Donkey Kong Bonanza that just doesn't have the same appeal as it would if that character was Mario. If I had to wager, those are going to be the best-selling titles of the first year of the Nintendo Switch 2's life, and will very likely be in the top 5 of the best-selling games in the Nintendo Switch 2. Actually, Donkey Kong will realistically fall down to around 10th place, or maybe just below that. So it's not like these are bad games, and it's not even necessarily that they're bad choices. They're choices that appeal to Nintendo buyers, Nintendo fans in general. But even then, as Nintendo fans, no matter how excited you are for the next Mario Kart, no matter how over the top crazy you go for another Donkey Kong, and how giddy you got because Mario Galaxy 2 is making a return. And honestly, even the same thing with Kirby Air Riders. Even you cannot deny that these pale in comparison to something like a new Legend of Zelda, a new 3D Mario, even a new mainline exclusive Switch 2 Pokemon title, Animal Crossing, an exclusive 2D Mario, an exclusive Luigi's Mansion game. Those are games that would break the internet, as the youngins say. And they're games that, if they were announced, would absolutely sell out Switch 2s all across the world. But the fact of the matter is, nothing that has been announced so far has been a system seller of proportions that people can't fathom, which is not all that common for a Nintendo console. So what happens now is, on one end, you have a whole group of people that were like, well, you know what? I sat out for this long. Donkey Kong Bonanza is not worth me buying a Switch 2 for. I'm just gonna wait for next year until more games are announced and maybe there's a bigger library of games for me to buy. Also, maybe by then I'll have an idea of how many day one DLCs or first month or two's DLCs Nintendo's gonna pack onto different titles, so I know what I'm gonna be spending. But on the opposite side of it, you also have a bunch of people that bought their Switch 2 and that were waiting for that reason. Like, they ended up being proactive, got the console, and they're sitting there and they're still not hyped about anything. They're not using it. And it gets even worse because a lot of the titles that they might have had from the Nintendo Switch 1, this library that they built up over time, runs worse on the Switch 2 because it's 720p and it's stretched out. And even worse than that, they might have bought this console expecting that every one of their games would get that free update that we saw in something like Mario Odyssey. You know, Nintendo took 8 years to get to the Nintendo Switch 2. I don't think it's too far-fetched to assume that somebody was like, worst case scenario, I got my Smash Bros. Ultimate, I got Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, I got my Pokemon games, I got whatever games you have that are first party, those are automatically gonna get like an up-res and they're just gonna run better on the Switch 2 for free. That it's not even necessarily for free, it's you bought a console to get it. Like, you expect that improvement in performance. And I imagine a lot of people that went into the Nintendo Switch 2 were expecting that to automatically happen, because that's something that they saw across PlayStation 5 and Xbox. While yes, perhaps not realizing that even with PlayStation 5 and Xbox, it took them a while to update some of these games. But with Nintendo, it's been a while. They've had this console on the sidelines for quite a while, setting it to the side. Everybody was just kind of expecting to buy into this thing and they would just get better performances across the board. And by a better performance, I don't mean Scarlet and Violet work now. I don't mean that when you're trying to change colors in Smash Bros. It doesn't load anymore. I mean the treatment that those Switch 1 games that got the updates, the free update, the resolution and frame rate bumps, whether it's right or wrong, a lot of people that bought the Nintendo Switch 2 were just expecting that that was going to be coming with the console. They'd put their games in and they would work better. At least the first party titles. But the reality is they didn't even get that. And look, I understand that it's been 3 months, and I understand for a lot of people, you don't need to like every single game that's come out. You just need like 1 or 2 games to tick with, and that's good enough. But the issue is the expectation of a lot of people coming into the Nintendo Switch 2 was incorrect. And you can blame Nintendo, or you can blame that buyer. Or honestly, even more so, you can blame a lot of the discourse that happens online with all of these people that are just assuming that things are going to be great, and then they're like, yeah, it's going to be good. And then when people complain and say, hey, it wasn't that good, they turn it right around and be like, well, what did you expect? It's a handheld. And they tell the buyer that maybe they shouldn't have bought it in the first place. Clearly, you did not understand what you were getting into. And I think they're right. I think a lot of people just genuinely did not understand what they were buying when they were buying the Nintendo Switch 2. They didn't realize that they were just buying the Nintendo Switch 1 again. And honestly, I don't blame them too much because they were paying the price of a PS5 for the Nintendo Switch 1 again. For a lot of them, it's taken them 3 months to realize that. Either that console is just going to be put away until something good comes out, or they're just going to throw in the towel and sell it. But I think it's worth keeping a lookout for just exactly how many people right now genuinely regret buying the Nintendo Switch 2, or at the very least feel like they should have waited a little bit longer. Because I've been noticing it for a few months, but after this last Direct, it seems like almost everybody's saying it online. Anyway, that's all I got for right now. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.